at the start of each chapter, so that way the files match up. Along with the exercise files, we've given you two basic rigs. Let me show you the first of those. We're going to go File, Open, and we should be in our Chapter 0 Scenes directory because we've set our project. And we have two characters. One is called Full Character, one is called Simple Character. So let's go ahead and open up the Simple Character, and we'll show you that one first. As you can see, it's a very, very basic character. And what I really wanted to do with this is just to give you a nice, light, easy to animate character that can be used just to get the hang of animation. If we go through this, we can see that we have basically a number of controls for the character. If you grab on any one of these curves, you can see that we can actually manipulate the character. So for example, if I grab this one here, this star-shaped one, you can see here that this is called the hips. And it controls the hips. So if I hit W for move, I can move the hips. Now we also have a number of other ones here. The one I want to show you first off are these knee controls. And these can get a little bit tricky, but what they do is they can just control the direction of the knee. So the knee basically points at these objects. Now the feet are basically done with what's called inverse kinematics, which means that you can move the feet and the hips will stay in place. Going up the character, we all have three spine controls, and typically I select those by going into my select tool or by hitting Q. And then shift selecting, I can shift select 1, 2, 3 of these, or I can select them individually. And you'll notice they're named Spine 0, Spine 1, and Spine 2, for a total of 3. And typically what I do is when I manipulate the character, I will select all of them. So I will shift select all of these, and then these will typically only rotate. So you can rotate these to rotate the character's spine. Now I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Moving further up, we can take a look at the arms. The arms are by default set to what's called forward kinematics, which means you're rotating the arms. So I can basically just rotate any one of these joints however I want. Now I didn't put any limits on these, so you have to be careful, particularly with the elbow, that you don't move it this way or this way. I typically tend to move it along the y-axis, but I left the other two axes open just in case you needed that room to animate. And then the hands are very simple. They're actually more like mittens. And they also have controls for each of the joints. Now moving up a little bit further, we also have this switch. It has an F on it right now, and that stands for forward kinematics. In other words, that will switch the character from the arm being forward kinematics, which is rotations, to inverse kinematics, which is position. So in order to switch between forward and inverse kinematics, go ahead and select this arrow, hit the move tool, and then move it from left to right to switch between F and I. F is forward kinematics, I is inverse. So in forward kinematics, I'm rotating the arm. In inverse kinematics, I'm positioning the arm. Now notice how this changes a little bit. We go from having these, basically these little spheres on each joint, to having a hand control and then a direction control. And this is very much like the feet. So I have hand controls here, and then this, very much like the knees, controls the angle of that elbow. So I can switch between those just by animating this. And finally, we have head and neck controls. And again, those are rotational, so you can just rotate the character's head. Now one more control I want to show you is basically the main node, which is called character root. And what this is just the root of the character. It allows you to position the character anywhere in the scene. So all motions of the character are going to be relative to this node. If we take a look at this in the outliner, you can see that under the character root we have all of the controls for the character. Now there are some additional directories. One is for the skeleton of the character, and the other one is for the geometry. Now we're not going to touch those. All the controls we need to manipulate the character are under the character root node. Now if we go over to the channel box, you'll see below it we also have the layer editor. And this character is divided up into a number of layers. Now we may be turning these on and off during the course. The top ones are basically for geometry, so I can turn off the eyes, the head, the upper part of the body, and the lower part of the body. So I can turn on and off any one of these pieces of geometry. These are set to R, which means that they'll render, but you can't select them. So I can't select that head. If I want to be able to select it, I can turn that off and select it directly. But again, this is geometry. We really want to control the head using these spline controls. So I'm going to go ahead and set that back to R. We also have controls for the upper and lower part of the character as well, so I can turn on and off different types of controls. And also the skeleton of the character is actually hidden. So that's a brief overview of this character rig. As we start animating, you'll start to get the hang of how to manipulate this rig and how to work the character. Now let's take a look at the full character rig. I'm going to open a scene called fullchar.ma, which is our full character. As you can see, this character is very close to the other character that we had. In fact, it's just a more complex version. As you can see, the character has full geometry. In other words, his geometry deforms. So for example, if I select the foot here, you can see that his geometry deforms. The character also has full hands. So instead of those mitten hands, we have a three-fingered hand. So for example, we could select the index fingers here and rotate them. So this gives you a lot more control over hand gestures and that sort of thing. Now the most important change to this character is in the facial controls. I've given him a full face with full control over that face. So if you want to move the head, it's still pretty much the same. So you just select this ring and you can rotate it, and you notice this head control rotates with the character. The controls themselves manipulate various portions of the face. So the lower part of the face, in other words the mouth, is the lower part of the controls. The upper part is the eyes. So let's start with the mouth controls. All of these controls are translation. So if you select this, all you have to do is hit W or select your move tool in order to manipulate these. Now these all manipulate in X or Y or in a single dimension. So if I select the jaw control, which is labeled here as jaw, you can see how if I move this up or down, it opens and closes his jaw. If I move it left and right, you can see how it actually biases that, so you can get some left-right jaw motion. So if you wanted them to chew, for example, you can do left-right type motion. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Let's move over to the next one called dial, and that's short for dialogue. And now these are most of the phoneme shapes that we use for lip sync. Now this will be used in combination with the jaw as well as some other controls. But let's take a look how this works. If you move this control to the right, you can see he goes into an O sound. If you move it to the right and all the way to the bottom, that O closes down to an OO. If you move it straight up, it kind of just neutralizes. Now the other side of this starts with the consonant sound, or CH, kind of that smile. And then as you move down, those lips close and it kind of tightens up so you can get like an M or a B or a P. So simply by moving this through 2 dimensions, you can get probably about 80% of the dialogue controls that you want. If you can see, these move from -1 to +1 as we go along this. And now if we want to center this out, all we have to do is select both of these, type 0, and that centers it out. The next one is the smile control, and this is pretty straightforward. If you move it straight up, he smiles. Move it straight down, he frowns. And then we can control that. If you move it up to the left, he kind of gives a half grin on either side or a half frown on either side. And again, the center of this is 0, so if I select these two translations, I can set those to 0. Now along the bottom are two special phonemes. One is F, basically F or V, and that's where the lip is tucked underneath the top teeth. So for the F or the V sound. Now another cute little trick here is if you move that in the opposite direction, it kind of gives a little pout, which could be useful. And again, the center of this is 0, so I'm just going to 0 that out. The sh sound is basically just kind of, it's this shape here. Now this is a pretty strong shape. You may not use this too much, but it's there in case you need it. Now the next ones are sneer and grr, and they kind of do the opposite on the top and bottom lip. So the sneer controls the muscles around the nose that lift up the lips into a sneer. So you can do left sneer, right sneer, or you can go in the middle. And again, the center of that is 0. Grr actually activates what are called the corrugators, which kind of give you that fear, or kind of that, concern, fear, anxiety type of emotion. And again, that biases to left and right. Now along the top, we have the eye controls. Now the first one here is this big circles with what are basically the eyelids. So if I can select one or both of these, so let's select one, and you can see I can lower that eye, but it doesn't go all the way down. In order to do a full blink, you have to grab the one on the bottom and pull that up to give a full blink. Now if you want to, you can just grab both of these and pull them down, and grab both of these and pull them up for a full blink. Or you can do any combination of these to give kind of some cockeyed look. So if you want them to kind of do one up, one down, that sort of thing, you have the control to do that. Now in the center of this is the pupil control. So I'm going to go ahead and shift select both of these and then move those. And as you can see, it just gives him left, right, up, down, and just gives him eye direction control. And again, you can do these separately if you want, or you can select them and do them together. Now the one here is just called eyes wide, and that kind of gives him that surprised look. So if you're going to just do a surprise type of action, you can do that there. And then that last one are the brow controls, and these are very similar to the dialogue and the smile control in that each corner is a different type of, so if you want him to lift his brow, lift the brow, make a worry brow is here, an angry brow is here, and these actually work in opposite. So if you want to do both worry, you have to kind of select them separately and put them down, and so that way you get anger, or if you want to put them out to the side, then you can get worry, and so on. But again, all of these bias back to 0, so all you have to do is just type 0 to get them back to center. So those are the basic controls of the full character. Now we're not going to be using this character until a little bit later in the course. I'm kind of saving him for when we actually do dialogue and lip sync and facial animation. For the first part of the course, we're mostly going to be working with the simple rig. But if you want, you can use this rig instead of the other rig. The control names are all the same, and really the only difference for those exercises are going to be the way that you pose the hands. If you want, you can use your own rigs with this course. I'm not doing anything that's out of the ordinary with the rigs, and you should be able to apply it to just about any good character rig. Now you can get these from your production company, you can build them yourself, or if you want, you can also just do a quick Google search for my character rig, and that will come up with a whole bunch of different rigs that you can use. Now when you use a different type of rig, the controls will be different. So here's some ones that I've downloaded. You know, every single one is a little bit different, has a little bit different controls, but if you want to use them, you're more than welcome, and they will work with this course. Now, when I started animating way back in the 90s, screens were actually made out of glass. Usually you had a Trinitron tube, you had a 20-inch monitor or something like that. And one of the tricks that I learned way back was to draw on the screen. All I'd have to do was to reach for a dry erase marker and I could draw over my characters on the screen. Because the screen was made of glass, it was very easy. You just draw on the screen. When you're done, you just wipe it off with a cloth. In the past couple of years, flat screens have really taken over. Now, a lot of those screens are made of plastic, which makes them not really that compatible with dry erase markers. So I adapted my original technique to a more virtual technique, which will actually help this course. For the PC, I use a program called Linktivity Presenter. Now what this does is it simply allows me to draw over Maya on the screen. Now this can come in very handy when you're trying to tweak a pose, get an animation path, do a number of different things, and you want it to look good in 2D, but you're animating it or posing the character in 3D. This particular program has a number of different functions. I really only use 3 of them. One is a pen tool, the other one is the cursor tool, and then there's an erase tool. Now if you select the pen tool, you can select whatever color you want, and then you can draw over the screen. So if you use a pen, you can actually get more accurate. I'm actually using a mouse right now. But you can actually draw over your character to get poses, to draw a line of action, to draw motion paths, really whatever you want to draw. And then once you've drawn over the screen, all you have to do is go to what's called cursor mode, and then you can manipulate your character and the drawings will stay on the screen. So for example, I can move his arm or his head or move the character around, and I could still have that drawing on the screen. So now I have a reference from where his head was to where it's going to be, and that gives me a little bit of an easier way to animate. Now you can do some of this with the ghosting feature in Maya, but sometimes I find this a lot more interactive and particularly good when posing characters. Now once you're done with all of this, all you have to do is just hit the Erase All button and it goes away. So again, just to reiterate, you can find Linktivity just by doing a Google search for Linktivity Presenter, and it's pretty much the first thing that comes up. Now this is one of many programs that can do this. When I recorded this, this is a free download. I can't guarantee that this will be free forever. Hopefully it will be. But if not, there are other programs that will do similar things, and they can come in very handy when animating in 3D. For those of you who are using OS X on the Macintosh platform, there is a screen draw tool that you can use as well. I did some searching and I found one called Magic Pen, which should work. And the way that you find it is basically just go in Google, type Magic Pen for the Mac, and you should find it. Now I found it on CNET, but you may find it in other places as well, and it's a free download. It's a free piece of software, so it should be good to go with that. So let me go ahead and close my browser here. Now once you install Magic Pen, it should show up either in the applications folder, and I've dragged it here to my dock, so you can just double click on it, and when you do, what happens is this little icon comes up. And once this icon is here, we have a number of options. One is we can choose our color, and then we can actually just draw. So you can just draw on the screen here. Now we have some menu options here, and the most important one is Clear Pad. This software actually does support what are called multiple pads, so you can actually draw in multiple layers. We're really not going to go that deep into it, so you can pretty much just draw and clear. That's basically all you need to do, so we can just draw something and clear it. If you're going to be using this in Maya, you will need to switch applications. So for example, if I'm in Maya right now, I can pretty much just use Maya the way it is. But if I want to draw over it to illustrate a pose or something like that, I will have to go down to my dock and open up Magic Pen, and then I can draw over Maya. Then, once I go back into Maya, I can operate Maya as I want, and the drawing will still be over that. I can always go back into Magic Pen and then clear, and so on. So really what you're doing is you're switching between the applications. So this should work for most OS X users. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get going with the course. When you first start animating characters, one of the first things you'll need to learn is how to pose characters. So let's go over a few of the finer points of what makes up a good pose for a character. Now the first thing that you need to be aware of is what's called line of action. Now what that is if you take a pose, you'll see that each pose, if it's a good pose, it will have a line. The character will follow a line of action. And this will lead the audience's eye to the character. It'll be pleasing to the eye. It may draw attention to something, but a good line of action is really important for a good pose. Here's another character. You can see the line of action is downward. You see the character is a little bit sad. And then we can also have line of action that help with describing actions. So for example, if this character is going to toss a ball, this isn't really a very good line of action. It's really just straight up and down. If we extend that line, give him a really backwards reach, you'll have a much stronger animation. And so when he throws the ball, that line of action actually will follow his body through. Another important thing is called silhouetting. Again, if you have a character in a pose, typically the pose will read well if you can see it in silhouette. This is because the audience's eyes tend to draw out the outline of the character first and then look at what's inside. Here's that exact same pose at a different angle. So all I did was I moved that camera a bit, and if you look at this, it looks confusing, even compared to the silhouette. And if you look at this in silhouette, you don't even really know what's going on with this character because you don't have a strong silhouette. Here are some other poses. Now again, this pose will have a strong silhouette. You can see that things are out from the body and that the outline of the character reads really well, as compared to something like this, which is just, again, the camera turned a little bit. This doesn't read. You don't really know what the character's doing here. Here you do. Last thing I want to talk about is weight and balance. Any pose that you create for your character needs to have balance and weight. Now typically, when you pose a character, the character will come kind of rigid, like this. And this isn't really what I would call a balanced pose. It's very symmetrical. There's really no sense of weight to the character. He almost looks like a mannequin or something. And you can create weight by distributing the weight through the character. So you can see that now the weight is on one foot. The character has a bit of an arc. This is much more pleasing than something like this. When you do something like this, you want to make sure the character's weight is balanced, that he's not going to tip over, something like this. So if you push him too far in one direction, again, he's going to appear unbalanced. The pose is not going to be stable. It's not going to be pleasing to the eye. The audience is going to say, wait, something's wrong here. So when you create poses, you want to make sure that the poses have a good line of action, they silhouette well, and that they also have weight and balance. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start actually posing characters for animation. Before we actually get into posing and keyframing our characters, I'd like to actually set up some custom functions that will help me along with this particular character. Now we're working with the simple character, but this will work really with any type of character you want. Maya is really great in that it allows you to create custom functions. You're probably already using them, and these are just the standard shells, and these are just actually custom buttons that Maya provides. And we can actually create our own by using a little bit of Mel scripting. First of all, let's go into General Editors and go into what's called the Script Editor. And I'm going to go ahead and push this guy over so we can get everything here on the screen. It's a very tight screen here. And what you can see is every time you do something in the character, it shows up in this window. So for example, if I select the root node of the character, it'll say select hips. So what I can do is I can take all of these and make them into a button. So the first button that I want to create is one that selects all the parts of the character. So all I'm going to do is just go into select mode, and that's hitting the Q button. And then I'm just going to go through and select all of the various parts of the character. And you can see how as I select them, they show up here in the window. So I just want to go through and select each of the spines and the arms on both sides, the neck, the head, and then I also want to get the thumbs and the hands. So I can just shift select and rubber band select all of these hands and all of these thumbs. Let's see if I can get this on the other side here. Now I'm not going to select the forward inverse kinematics at this point, so I don't really need to keyframe that. So now that I have all of these selected, you can see I've got basically a list of what I've selected. This is where I deselected right before I started selecting everything, and all of these are the selections of everything in the character. So all I have to do is click and drag and highlight all of those commands. Then all I have to do is hit this button here. It says Save Script to Shelf. So I click on that, and then I can just give it a name. Well, let's just call it Select All. And when I do that, it gives me this, do you want to save it as a Python or a Mel script? I'm going to choose Mel script, and there we go. Now we have a button that will select everything in the character. So if I deselect this, now I can select everything. Another nice little command that we can do is something that keyframes everything in the character. So all I have to do at this point is just hit the S key, or if I go into animation, I can just go animation set key. So I'm just going to go ahead and set a key, and watch what happens. It says, gives me a few little error messages, but this is the command that I want. Set keyframe, and it says keyframes for all of these things. And if you notice, all of this is the names of everything that I had selected. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to save script to shelf, and then I'm just going to call this one Key All. So this creates a keyframe for all of the major components of the character, and we're going to save that as a Mel script. So now I have two scripts here, and these can be very, very handy. One selects everything in the character. The other keyframes everything in the character. So for example, if I go out here to say frame 12 and I hit Key All and select something, you'll see that now I have, in fact, let's go ahead and select all, a keyframe here where I started and at frame 12. Now this is very handy when you start creating stock poses or you want to lock in a character's pose. So we can refine this a little further. You can obviously create buttons for parts of the character. You can have one for the arms or one for the spine or the feet or whatever. We can also extend this in more complex characters to keyframe everything in the face, for example. So create some custom shells for your character, and that will help you in the future when you're keyframing that character. There is another way to select objects within a character that doesn't involve creating custom shelves and custom buttons, and that's to simply use layers. So for example, with this character, we do have a custom button that allows us to select everything, but if we want, we can also use our layers option. So we can go into that by going into our channel box and then just pulling open our layers palette. And then if I want, I can select any part of the character just by highlighting the layer and going Layer, Select Objects. So if I want to, I can select every object in the upper body or the lower body. If you create a rig that has really good layering, this can be a good alternative to using custom buttons. Now the one thing about this is that the layers are pretty fixed. With a custom shelf and a custom button, you can select at anything you want. With layers, you're pretty much restricted to what's in that specific layer. But if this is more comfortable for you, then go ahead and use this method. Let's go ahead and start posing and keyframing our character. We're going to block out several poses, and really this is just about the process of creating the pose for a character. Typically, when you start with a character, you're going to get him in a neutral pose, something like this. And this really isn't a natural pose. So let's go ahead and make it a little more natural. Before I do that, I'm actually going to lock this pose in. I kind of like this pose for one reason, and that's because it's a neutral pose, and I can always come back to this if I want to unwind the character. For the sake of this, I'm just going to go ahead and keyframe this at frame 1. So I want to just take everything in the character and just hit that Key All button that I created in my custom shelf. You should create one for your shelf as well. Now I have this pose locked in at frame 1. Now typically what we'll do is we'll take that neutral pose and we'll move it before the start of the animation. So we'll move it to frame 0 or frame -1. So at least we have it, but it doesn't show up in the animation. For the sake of this, we can leave it at frame 1. Let's go a few frames forward. Let's go to frame 3, and let's kind of relax this pose a little bit more. Now with a character like this, the first thing we see is the arms, and they're definitely not relaxed. So I'm going to go ahead and select the shoulders, and we're using forward kinematics here, and I'm just going to rotate these down. And so now that I have that in place, well, it's a little bit more relaxed, but it's by no means natural. I mean, it looks like the guy's standing at attention, and unless you're animating him in a military lineup, it's really not going to be a good pose. But I'm going to go ahead and save this anyways. I'm going to hit Key All just so we have it. So now I've got a pose at frame 1 and a pose at frame 3. Now let's go ahead and make a much more naturalistic pose for this character. Let's go ahead and start playing with the weight. Now the first thing you want to do with a pose is understand where the weight of the character is and how the line of the character is going to be moving. Typically with the pose, I start with the hips and the feet because that's the center of weight distribution for the character. The weight of the character is being pulled down by gravity. And what's supporting it, what's counteracting that, is the force of the legs supporting that weight. So this is the area where most of the weight distribution of the character is transferred to the ground. So we want to make sure that we get the hips and the feet done right. So I'm going to start with the hips. Well, first thing I want to do is I want to kind of get them down a little bit. So let's go ahead and make this kind of a meek pose. Let's start with making him kind of a shy character. So I'm going to move the hips down a little bit, get some bend in those knees, and then I'm going to actually rotate the hips back just a bit. And what this is doing is I'm trying to give him kind of a curved spine. So the first thing I want to do is rotate the hips back, so that way I can rotate all of these spine nodes forward. So I'm selecting all of the spine, and I'm going to rotate that forward just a little bit. And you can notice how once I start to get that, you can see how it's kind of a bit of a sad sack, almost gives him a pot belly sort of look. And even just doing that is much better than what we had here. So this is my pose, and then just by shifting his weight a little bit, we get a much better line of action, really. And so we can also play a little bit more with things like his feet. So I'm going to go ahead and turn his feet in maybe just a little bit, kind of make him a little pigeon-toed. And again, I'm just kind of playing with this character. Each character that you have will have a specific way of standing and a specific way of acting. So I can also play with the arms a little bit. Maybe his arms are a little bit out and turned in a little bit. And also, once I've rotated that back, notice how this arm is kind of going at an angle. And I really want it to be straight up and down. So I'm going to rotate this and kind of straighten it out. Straight arms like that, they're kind of unnatural. So I'm going to go to the elbow and give it more of a natural bend. And what this will do is actually it will almost mirror the line of action that I'm starting to develop here. So I'm kind of starting to get this kind of S shape with the character. And so if the arms are kind of in that, then it just kind of supports that line of action and gives a much stronger pose. And if I want, again, he's kind of turning everything in, so maybe I can even turn the wrists in. They're kind of a little square. And again, I've got very straight hands, so maybe give some curve to that, and we can do the same on the other arm. Now, I don't have to do the exact same thing on both sides, because symmetry, we don't really want the character to be too symmetrical. So for this particular pose, he is kind of just standing there, but again, I don't want a ton of symmetry. Maybe I can even lean him a little bit to one side or the other, just to kind of give him a little bit of variation. And again, I can play with the head, and sometimes if he's kind of a sad character, he may also be looking down. And again, that will support this kind of S shape that we're getting. So just by kind of understanding how gravity is pulling the character down and a little bit about the attitude of the character, we've got a much stronger pose, even just for a default pose. So we went from this to this to this. So you can see how we've got kind of a nice character pose here. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and key everything just so we have it. And now I want to go ahead and maybe do one more pose. And let's kind of pose him in the opposite direction. So one of the things I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to copy some keyframes. So I'm going to select everything in the character. And if you notice, we've got 3 sets of keyframes. 1, 2, 3. But what I want to do is actually put him back to that neutral pose. Or actually, let's go back to this pose. So what I can do is I can right-click, copy, and that copies all the keyframes because I hit select all, and then just paste. So now I have a neutral starting place to do another pose. So this time, instead of rotating him back, let's go ahead and move him forward, make him a little bit more assertive. So I'm going to actually move his weight forward and maybe even rotate the hips forward because I want him to be almost like a character that's in your face. And so that means I want him to start kind of getting into your space a little bit. And then what I can do is then, again, play with the spine because he's going to be a little bit more proud. He's going to have a little bit more spine here. Now one thing I notice is that these knees, again, they're a little straight here. So I like having a little bit of bend in the knee. It shows that there's tension there. If they're completely straight, it's not very natural. And also you want to make sure that the weight of the character is over the center of the feet. So once we do that, you can see how we're starting to get a little bit of a different pose because he's actually kind of moving forward. And again, because he's being kind of more big and boastful, you want to make him bigger. Almost like how a bird or a butterfly will open its wings to scare off predators, people do the same thing. So I want to kind of make him give more space. Basically, I want to make him take up more visual room because he's a tough character. And so maybe complete those into fists and then kind of put his arms out a little bit more here. And again, bend his arms. What I'm trying to do here is, again, I want to give him so that he's occupying more space. And again, just kind of rotate those. And just by doing something like this, even maybe tilting that down a little bit, because what I'm really trying to do is get him more aggressive. In fact, I can even push him forward just a little bit more. So as I push him forward, though, you notice how his head is turning back. Well, I want to make sure that his head is looking forward. So there. So now we have a pose. We've gone from totally straight to kind of meek to a little bit more assertive. And all we really did was just change the pose of that character. Even just putting the feet out a little bit more will also give him a wider stance and make him appear stronger. So, as you can see, posing a character is really pretty simple. All you need to do is start with the hips, make sure that the character has a good strong base, and then understand the mood of the character and where you want the character to be, and then just pose them into place by moving the joints. And one of the things I like to do is when I have major poses like this, I like to keyframe everything just to make sure I lock them in. So go ahead and pose your character and have fun. When you work with the same character in many scenes, a lot of times that character will be adopting similar or the same poses across multiple scenes. So sometimes it's easier to create a library of poses that you can use as raw material to construct other poses. Now what I've done here is I've created a file called Many Poses, and it has about 10 or 12 poses in here. I've got a real simple pose with his arms at his side, his hands at his hips, him kind of showing his palms on both hands, and then that slouchy pose, the proud pose that we did before, and then a couple more specific poses. Now these can be any pose you want. It can be any number of different poses. But let me show you the technique that I use for mixing and matching poses to create new ones. If I select everything in the character, you'll notice that I have one major pose every 2 frames. When I animate a scene, typically I'll start at frame 1 or somewhere in that range, but I want to be able to hang on to these poses to use in another scene. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to just slide these frames into the negative frame numbers. So right now this animation is starting at frame 1, but if I just type in -20 into the start time of the animation, you can see how all of a sudden I've got some space here, and if I click on the slider here and move it over, you'll see that I can actually keyframe into the negative frames. So what I can do is I can actually take these frames and just select them. I'm shift selecting them on the timeline, and then I can just drag them back. By doing that, these poses are now in the negative frames. Now I have my default pose here at -18. One of the things I'd like to do is get that maybe to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that. Now remember, I still have everything selected, and put it at frame 0. So now I have basically the character at 0 at frame 0, but I have all these other poses. So as I go into the animation, let's say I want to start him at a specific pose. Let's say I want to start him at this pose. So what I can do is select all, find that keyframe, and since I have everything selected, all I have to do is copy and paste that. So let's go ahead and start that at frame 1, which is going to be the start of our animation. So now we start there, and then I can go into any other type of pose. So let's say I want him to go into that pose there, the one at -4. So I can go ahead again and copy, and then I can just slide this wherever I want. Let's go ahead here, maybe to frame 6, and go paste. So now he's going from frame to frame. Obviously we'll need to in between that. We'll get into that later. But you can see how now I'm taking my poses from my kind of stored poses here and using them as raw material. So if I want him to stand straight up, or if I want him to straighten out his spine, all I have to do is select those spine nodes and find a place where his spine is straight, copy, and paste. So now what I'm doing is I'm combining poses. So I'm taking the spine from a different pose and putting it on this other one. Let's say I want his hands on his hips. All I have to do is select the hand along with the fingers, and then find one of those poses where his hands are on his hips. Right, there's one right there, frame 14. So I just copy that, come back out here, and now when I paste, all I'm pasting is that arm, and now I've got his hand on his hip. Rather than try and unwind this pose and undo this pose and put it into another one, all I have to do is copy and paste. So this method makes posing much more modular. So if you create a nice library of stock poses and gestures, store them in the negative keyframe, you'll have a lot of raw material to pose your characters with later, and posing will go a lot more quickly. One of the most important things you need to understand when animating a character is the concept of force. Forces act upon a character, and then the character responds to those forces. Forces can fall into 2 basic categories. One is external forces, those forces which are outside the character. These can be gravity, wind, another character pushing your character around, and so on. The other type of force acting upon a character are internal forces. In other words, the forces that the character creates himself. The muscles acting against gravity to keep the character standing up, for example. So I have a simple scene here that we can use to illustrate forces. In other words, use to illustrate external versus internal force. And the scene is called Moving Platform, and it's basically just the character moving on a platform. In other words, it's basically just the platform moving. So the first thing we want to do is attach the character to the platform, and then we'll go ahead and animate all of the external forces on the character, and then have the character come to life and resist those forces. So the first thing we want to do is just very simple, and that's attach the character to the platform. The easiest way to do that is to go into the outliner. So I'm going to go Window, Outliner, and we've got just a couple of objects in the scene. Now the platform is basically just a cube, and it's called P Cube 1, and you can see that it's got a couple of keyframes. It's got a keyframe at frame 1, frame 25, and at frame 48. So in order to get the character onto this platform, I need to do a hierarchy. So the easiest way to do that is to select the character root, which is that node which allows me to move the character around, middle click in the outliner, and drag over the cube. So now you can see I've created a hierarchy, I've got the cube, and then the character is beneath that. And now when I press play, the cube is controlling the character. Okay, so now that we have this set up, let's go ahead in the next lesson and start working with the forces. At this point, we have the character on the platform and moving. Obviously, there's nothing happening other than the platform and the character moving. Now, the character is going to be affected by the motion of the platform. He's also going to be affected by gravity. So let's go ahead and work on those forces. So the first thing we have is we have two forces. We have gravity is pulling this character down, and then we have the actual motion of the platform, which is actually moving him right at the feet. Now when we have this forward motion, we have what's called drag, which is basically the main mass of the character is right up here. That will not want to move. Go back to the laws of motion. A body at rest will want to stay at rest. So that part of him will want to hang back. It doesn't want to move forward. So as this moves forward, from an animation perspective, it'll appear as though a force is pushing him in the chest, when in reality it really is just the body itself wants to stay where it's at. So we can animate this by doing some keyframing. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and just drop those arms to his side. Just want to give him a little bit more of a relaxed pose. We'll play with the arms and the rest of the body a little bit later. But I just want to start with the center of mass of the character, which is centered around the hips. Now when we pose characters, we typically pose starting with the hips, and when we're working with these sorts of force problems, we also a lot of times will start with the hips. So I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe here at frame 1. Now I'm going to move forward a little bit, maybe a couple frames, maybe 3 or 4 frames. Let's go to frame 5, and let's give the impression that that body wants to stay in place. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate it back a little bit and move it back. So right there, I want to basically drag him back. And you can see even right now, that feels like he's got a little bit of force acting upon him. He's starting to understand the flexibility of this character. But he's not going to stay back the whole time because this is moving at a pretty constant rate. So again, he will tend to straighten up. So I'm going to go back to frame 1 and copy that keyframe, and then we're going to go forward, say about 10 frames or so, to frame 15. And I'm just going to paste that keyframe. So now he goes backwards, and now he kind of straightens up. And then at frame 25, where he starts to move back, I want to straighten him up again. And then we can do the opposite. We can go another couple of frames in, say about 5 frames again, And this time his body wants to keep going in that direction. So I'm going to move him forward and then also rotate that a bit and make sure that his heels are not off the ground there. And again, at frame 40, I want to go ahead and copy this and just straighten them up again. And then go back to the very beginning and let's make sure that we've got a keyframe there. So now what we've got is he's going backwards and forwards. So you can see that even right now we've got a much better sense of motion for the character. We've got a sense of force acting upon his body. Now one thing I'm noticing here is that we have a little bit of a bounce in the animation. Sometimes you have to be real careful in looking at these and you can kind of catch it, but notice how that as he comes past here, he actually overshoots this a little bit. So right here he feels like he's a little bit far forward and then he comes back a little bit. It looks almost like he's kind of more of a spring. He's kind of got this kind of back and forth motion. Now this may actually be a problem that we can diagnose in the graph editor. So I'm going to go into Window, Animation Editor's Graph Editor, and let's take a look at this. So I'm going to go ahead and select his hips, and let's take a look at the rotation curves for the hips. Okay. Specifically, I'm rotating him along the x-axis. So I'm rotating him back and forth. So if I select the Rotate X curve, immediately, let me go ahead and frame this by hitting F. Now what we have is it starts at 0, he goes down a little bit, he comes back up, and the next keyframe is at 0, as is this frame and this frame. But what I've got is I've got this curve is kind of overshooting right here, and then it undershoots, and that's what's giving me that kind of wobble in his motion. In fact, let me go ahead and highlight this, and you can see how the wobble and the curve kind of match up. Now that we can see what the problem is, it's very easy to fix it. One way would be to select these curves and unwind them, but the easier way is to select all the keys that are 0, and then all we have to do is hit what are called plateau tangents. And what that does is that makes sure that all of those are 0. So particularly here, where it goes from a 0 to a 0, you want to make sure that these two sections are flat. Now once we've done that, you can play it back, and now we have a very smooth motion. So this really is just the motion of the platform affecting the character. This is one of several forces that we're going to deal with. So let's go ahead and refine this a little more in the next lesson. Point, we have just the main mass of the character animating. We've got the platform moving forward and then the torso of the character reacting to that motion. But the character is made of many joints. The spine has several joints, the arms also, and the head all have joints that will be affected by these forces. So the character himself will move in stages. In other words, the feet move forward first, and then the hips start moving forward a little bit later, then the shoulders, and then once the shoulders start moving forward, the hands will start moving forward because everything wants to stay in place. So in other words, this force will start at the feet, then go to the hips, then the shoulders, then the arm and the hand. So each of these will drag behind what it's connected to by a few frames because it takes a while to get everything going. Now in animation terms, this is typically called secondary motion, but it also can be known as drag as well. So let's go ahead and start doing a little bit more realistic animation. First thing I want to do is go ahead and just select the 3 joints of the spine, set a keyframe for those, and then as it moves forward, I want to rotate that spine back just a little bit. Again, just to understand that the character has flexibility in his spine. And then as he comes forward here, he's going to straighten up. So again, we could actually animate those to 0. I can just type that in here, and that should straighten him up. So now he gets a little bit of bend in his spine, and the same this way. Now remember, the spine bends a little bit more forward than it does back, so we can give him a little bit more extension this way. And then again, he's going to straighten up. And let's just go to frame 40 and straighten him up, and I'm going to type 0 for his rotation. So now I've got a little bit more rotation here. Now, one of the things I forgot to do is I forgot to animate it to 0 at frame 25. I want him to kind of stay vertical until he moves forward again. So now once I have this, you can see it's a little bit more flexible. But again, this force, which is transmitting down the spine, gets to the shoulders a little bit later, and the hands will also drag behind. So let's go ahead and just animate one arm. I'm going to select the left shoulder, and then as that character bends back, you can see he kind of bends back around frame 5, but let's go a little bit further out and then rotate the arms back. And again, they're going to be dragging behind, so about frame 8, I want those to drag behind. You can see how it's kind of going behind, and then again, I want that to kind of settle out somewhere for the beginning here, say somewhere around maybe frame 20. I'm going to rotate those back to 0. And again, set a keyframe at 25. And then again, we're going to go in, say, about 7 or 8 frames. So 25 plus 7 is around frame 32. Rotate that forward. Go back a little bit, say around frame 42, 43. Bring that back to 0. And then go ahead and set a keyframe for that as well at 48. So now, you can see how, again, we're getting a lot more flexibility with this character. The force of being pulled along that platform is now being transmitted through almost the entire body. So let's go ahead and do the right shoulder as well. I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe at 1, 8. We're going to go ahead and move that arm back. Kind of zero it out around frame 20. Another keyframe at frame 25. Frame 32, he's forward. 42, it goes to 0. And then at 48, I'm just going to set a keyframe again just to get that locked in. You can see now we've got a lot more flexibility. He's starting to look more realistic. But again, these are just external forces. These are just the forces acting upon the character. Now I've got one more to worry about here, and that's the head. And again, the head is going to drag behind as well. So again, I'm going to do this around frame 8. Just rotate his head just a little bit back. Straighten him out. And again, 0 is neutral. Zero him out at 20. 25. I'm going to pretty much do what I did with the arms. 32. Bend him forward just a little bit. 42. Zero him out. And then another keyframe at 48. So I've got this pretty much on the same timing as the arms. So now once I have all of this, you can see how flexible he is. Now the thing is that, well, at this point, all he is a rag doll. There's no motion that he's providing to counteract any of these forces. So this is just the effect of external forces on our character. So in the next lesson, let's go ahead and start giving him a little bit more control over his body and a little bit more character. Now we've animated all of the external forces acting upon the character. And as you can see, he definitely looks like he's in motion, but there's really no intention from the character himself. He's kind of being pushed around like a rag doll. So let's first of all analyze the scene a little bit. What is the character's intention? Well, my thought was that the character doesn't want to be pushed around. He wants to stay stable. So the first thing we want to do is try and get him to force himself to, instead of being pushed back so far, to try and resist that. So we can do that by starting with some hip motion. So I'm going to go ahead and again select the hips. Now in order for him to actually push against the force, he needs some leverage. And with his feet straight like this, or with his knees straight like this, he's not going to be able to get the leverage he needs to act against the force that's dragging him back. So at frame 5, I want to move him down and forward a little bit. And what that's going to do is give the impression that he's consciously dropping his weight to get a little bit more leverage. So now he's got that, and now I can rotate him forward at frame 8 to try and get him into that position. So now gives a little bit more sense of motion. Let's try that again. That feels like it has a lot more intention than the one that's pushing him back. So we can do the same thing on the other side. So as he moves back, again, he needs to get leverage so that he can act upon it, which means he's going to drop his hips. And then a few frames past that, he's going to try and rotate himself up a little bit so he has a little bit more sense of balance. So even with that, it gives a little bit more of a sense of motion. But we can also give a little bit more intention, say for example when he's moving back. So when he's going back this way, I know that if I'm being pulled back, I want to see where I'm going. I don't want to just be pulled back and not look over my shoulder to see where I'm going. So at this point, I'm also going to start rotating his hips. So I'm going to go back to frame 30, rotate his hips, and then at frame 33, rotate them a little bit more, maybe even lift him up a little bit. So again, I want him to be looking over his shoulders. And now even at frame 40, I'm going to kind of turn the hips a little bit. Now again, I'm just playing with the hips. We will move up the spine to kind of rotate his shoulders as we go. Again, I just want to work with the hips a little bit. So let's see what that looks like. That gives him a little bit more intention. So let's go ahead and keep playing with this. I'm going to select the spine, and then we're going to do some more rotation. So as he rotates forward, I actually want to kind of rotate his shoulders a little bit so that as he comes up, I want him to straighten up. In fact, I'm just going to snag a straight spine from frame 1. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that spine, say around frame 33 or 34, and then rotate him a little bit. Now, I'm not worrying about the arms at this point. And then I want him to, again, be straightened up. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So now he's getting a bit of a sense of, okay, I'm looking over my shoulder. Well, let's go ahead and actually make him look over his shoulder. So as he comes back, I want to rotate that head and kind of cock it. And again, I want to try and get a nice line of action here. So what I'm looking here at this kind of almost like an S shape here. And that'll kind of give me a little bit stronger sense of motion here. So then as he looks over his shoulder, again, I want to straighten out that head. Now, I don't have anything happening with the arms. Again, we have to also give action to the arms, but let's go ahead and play with that in the next lesson. At this point, we have about half the animation done. We've animated the body and the head of the character resisting that motion of the platform. So let's see where we're at. See that as the platform moves forward, he kind of bends into it, and then as it moves backwards, he looks over his shoulder. Very simple. But you can also notice that the arms are still swinging like pendulums. They're very limp. They have absolutely no motor control. So let's go ahead and add the control of the character. Now, before we do anything, we need to pause and consider what the acting point is at this part of the story. So at this part of the story, I think the character simply wants to balance himself. So as this moves forward, he's going to put his arms out to the side a little bit, almost like a tightrope walker who's trying to keep his balance. So this will be our first pose, and then as he moves back, we can use the arms to accentuate that looking over the shoulder. So let's go ahead and do the first half of this. We're going to be working with the left arm. So I'm going to select the left shoulder, zoom in a little bit here, and then shift select the left elbow and the left wrist. And I want to make sure that I have a keyframe for all of those at frame 1. So we're going to start keyframing. So as we start rotating these joints, keyframes will naturally come up. So as he moves forward like this, again, this arm is back like a pendulum. We want it out like he's trying to keep his balance. So let's just go ahead and pose that in. I'm going to start with the shoulder and just work my way down the arm. So I'm going to go ahead and move his shoulder out from the body, and then I'm going to bend the elbow a little bit. Now this is actually pretty important because when the elbow is stiff, that means that the only force acting upon it is the force of drag. When he bends it, that's the indication to the audience that he is under control. Okay, so that gives a really good symbol that the character is controlling his arm. And then we can also play with the wrist a little bit. We can actually maybe rotate it around to get a nice little kind of arc there. So now we've got a much stronger pose. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So that first part of it, it looks like he's under control. Now contrast this to the other arm, which we haven't dealt with yet. And you can see that at that point, this arm still looks pretty limp. So let's go ahead and affect this. I'm going to go ahead and select my shoulder, my elbow, and my wrist on the right arm. S to set a key, and let's go forward to frame 8, and we'll go ahead and pose him in again. So I'm going to rotate that shoulder out, and then bend this elbow a little bit, and then maybe even bend this wrist a little bit. So again, I'm getting kind of a sense that he's catching his balance. And you can kind of see that in this pose a little bit. So again, I'm just trying to get a good, solid pose. Now, I'm not going to worry so much about the hands or the fingers at this point. Let's just go ahead and just work with the main joints of the arm. So now at this point, he's getting a good sense of balance. Things aren't working because we never keyframe the elbow and the rest of the arms throughout the rest of the animation. So we need to kind of do that. So I'm going to go ahead and select the shoulder. And you can see what's happening here is that that arm is wanting to go kind of back to its normal position. But I don't really want that. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and just select both shoulders, and we're just going to keyframe them forward from this point forward. So I'm going to select both shoulders, and then there's keyframes from 20 on. So I'm going to delete everything but frame 48, which is my loop point, and I want to make sure I keep that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those keyframes. So now he comes out, and then I can determine at frame 25, which is where he starts moving back, where those joints are going to be. So first thing I want to do is just kind of rotate it down. He is going to relax just a little bit. So I'm going to rotate that left shoulder down, maybe a little bit forward. And then also relax that elbow just a bit. Same on the other side. Let's go ahead and just relax that a little bit. And bring that down and relax that elbow just there. As well as this wrist. There we go. So now he's kind of going, whoa. And then he's kind of relaxing just a little bit. And then we get this backwards motion. So right there, as he's looking over his shoulder, we have a really good opportunity for a strong pose. So I'm going to move that arm out and back. He's looking over his shoulder. Kind of like that. And then do the same on the right shoulder. Just kind of move it out a little bit. You know, again, he's looking over his shoulder. And also his spine is turning, so this arm is going to want to stay a little bit in front of him. Okay, so now he's doing this. And it should actually give a much stronger pose. Yeah, so now that looks like he's really looking over his shoulder. Shoulders and the arms really help with that animation. So now here at frame 48, we need to kind of unwind that so we can cycle it. So what I want to do is just go ahead and hold that arm motion in a little bit longer, so maybe till about frame 40. And then, you know, kind of relax it just a little bit. Move that down. And again, relax that elbow just a bit. And then I want to cycle it. So I want to copy the keyframes from frame 1 to frame 48. So to do that, I need to select all the arms. So this actually is one reason why I might want to create a button on my timeline just to select the arms. It's not too hard to select them at this point, so I'm not going to go ahead and do that. And then just do paste, so now go back to the arms. So now we have a reasonably good cycle. Let's go ahead and play what we have. So we can tweak this a little bit more, but as you can see, we've added the character into this equation. When we started, he was just being pushed around like a rag doll. Now, his motor control is resisting those forces, and it gives him a little bit of a sense of character. Let's go ahead and play this one more time. you can see that he's got motion that he's creating. That really is the key to character animation. What sort of motion is a character creating? In other words, what sort of animation does the character create? Now let's go ahead and start the process of creating pose-to-pose animation. The first thing I do when creating this sort of animation is I try to line up all the major poses that I think the character will hit. And sometimes this will actually make me have to create new poses, it makes me cycle poses, that sort of thing. So let's go through some of the process here. In this case, I've already created a couple of poses just to speed things along. If we take a look at this character, he has poses every 2 frames. And this is just so I can see them a little bit easier and copy and paste them a little bit more quickly. Now I have a pose at frame 1, which is him standing back and just kind of crossing his arms across his chest. And then he reacts and waves. So I have 2 poses for the wave. When I start going through this, I need to start kind of mentally thinking the animation through, and I want to get the major poses lined up or sequenced. I'm going to worry about the exact timing a little bit later. So in this case, I really would like him to wave more than once. At this point, I've just got this. I've got one at 3 and one at 5. Well, I actually want more. So let's have him wave 3 times. So one of the things we can do is we can select everything in the character, make sure you have all of the nodes selected, then just right-click over the timeline, copy, and then you can just paste poses. This is one reason why I've created these mouse grips that allow me to select everything in the character, and these were discussed earlier in the lessons. I can do the same thing here at frame 5, which is copy and paste it again, say at frame 9. Now if I want, I can copy and paste multiple keyframes just by holding down the Shift key and dragging over the frames that I want to copy. So in this case, I want to copy frames 7 through 9, copy, and then maybe paste them at frame 11. So now I've got the character going from here to here, and then you can even almost, as we scroll through it, you can kind of actually see the wave that we have. Now, the one thing that I would like to do also is I think I need to add in an additional pose. If he's going to go from here to here, notice how he's shifting his weight. And typically, when a character shifts his weight, he drops his hips and he compresses a little bit. And I want to give this animation a little bit more of a dynamic quality, so I want to create an in-between pose. A pose between this one at frame 1 and this one at frame 3. Well, the first thing I want to do is I need to create some room. So I'm going to select all my keyframes, and I'm going to shift drag all the way down to frame 3 and just move those back 2 frames. So that way I have a little bit of a space to put in another pose. I don't really have time to go through all the mechanics of actually posing this character, and we've done that before in another chapter. So I actually have a pose that I've already created, and it's kind of hiding here at frame 46. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that out, and then right-click again and paste that to frame 3. So now I've got one additional pose. So instead of going from here to here, I'm going from here to here to here. Just even by scrubbing this through a few frames, you can see how that's got a lot more dynamic quality to it. And so what I've done in this frame, I've dropped the hips, so I've actually dropped his weight. You can see his weight going down, and then he rises back up into this position. This is basically squash and stretch. So he's squashing, and then he's stretching. And this gives a lot more dynamic quality to the animation. So to sum up, what we've done is we've sequenced the poses that we want our character to take, and the next step is to actually time out those poses so that they read well as a rough animation. Once we have the basic poses in sequence, we can start to time out the animation. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's refresh. I've got a couple of poses here. He goes from folded arms, squashes, comes up, and waves. Now, if we were to play this in real time, it would actually go by really quick. I'm going to go ahead and click my preferences here. Make sure I have this set to real time. We're animating at 24 frames per second. And let's just go ahead and play this. When I play it in real time, you can see, obviously everything's 2 frames apart, so it's going to be very, very fast. So let's go ahead and start spreading out these keys and start building the animation. Now the first thing I want is I want to make sure that he's holding at the beginning of the sequence. I'm going to hold him for a little bit less than a second, maybe about 20 frames or so. Now in order to do that, I need to copy another keyframe. So let's go ahead and select our character. And first thing I want to do is start to move these keyframes back. So I'm going to shift select everything up to, but not including that first keyframe. So down to frame 3. And then I'm going to grab here and just push those back. In fact, I'm going to push them back to about 24, which will give me enough room to put in that hole. So I'm going to go ahead to that first frame at frame 1, copy it, and paste that at frame 20. If I scrub this, you may get some weird sort of in-between like this. And if you do, let's go ahead over to our graph editor, which we'll be playing with, and let's take a look at what we have here. Now if the graph editor comes in a little bit too tight, all you have to do is hit the F key for frame, and that will go ahead and frame it. And if you notice here, it's automatically in betweening all these joints. Right there you can see it's kind of got just a weird little in-between there. Now what I like to do when I start to work with these keyframes is I select them all. I'll make sure that all my nodes of my character are selected. Then I select all the keyframes of all those nodes. And then I start off with step tangents. And what that does is it makes him jump from pose to pose. Let me show you how this works. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller so that you can see how this works against this. So as he scrolls through, he's going to jump 1, 2, 3. So he's basically just jumping from pose to pose, which actually can be very handy because then you can kind of see where everything goes and you can get basically the rough timing in, and then once we get that, then we can release the curves. The next thing I want to do is to make him go from here to the squash and then back up. So again, I'm going to select all of my parts of my character, and then I'm going to give myself some timing here. As he comes down and comes up, I'm wondering if it works best at 4 frames down and 4 frames up, or 6 frames down and 6 frames up. This is one of the places where you can start to play around with the timing and just get what feels right. I'm going to start with 4 frames in between each of these major keyframes, and then I'm going to go ahead and push that first wave back by maybe about 6 frames or so. That's what my instinct is telling me. I'm going to go ahead and close this window here. And let's just play this and see what it looks like. Obviously the wave is too fast, but really what we're looking at is that squash and that kind of coming up. And I'm wondering if that's enough. I think maybe I want to give a little bit more space to that. So I'm going to go ahead and select him again, and let's just go ahead and push back the second key here by about 2 frames, because what's happening here is this is actually closer to this, and he has to move a lot further to get up. So I think I'm going to squash him pretty quickly. So it's 4 frames to this pose, but 6 frames here. And what this does is it gives him a little more time to move up. So let's see how that plays. Yeah, that feels a little bit better. Now a lot of times when you're doing this, you are stepping from pose to pose. So this is, again, just rough timing. As we get further into the animation, we may have to adjust these poses again. Now the next thing I need to do is to time the wave. For this, I'm thinking maybe a couple of waves per second, so about 4 waves per second, which means every 6 frames at 24 frames per second. So in order to do that, I actually have more poses than timeline. So I need to extend my timeline a little bit. So let's go ahead and bring this out to 60 and give me a little bit more space. And then I'm going to zoom in here so we can just work on this last half here. So from here to here, I've got 6 frames. So from this pose to this pose. So all I really need to do is to basically space out the rest of these poses. So this one, I need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 36 to 42. That's 6 frames. So remember, these are 2 frames apart. So in order to make them 6 frames apart, I just have to slide them by 4. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm just shift selecting the keyframes on the timeline, and then I'm grabbing this little glyph here, and I'm just moving it over. So 48 to 54, that's another 6. And then we should be able to end this at 60. So I just select that and go to 60. Now I'm just going to go ahead and grab here, drag my timeline so I have everything on the screen. Let's go ahead and do a quick playthrough. So that's pretty good. I think that's good rough timing. Now there's one more thing that we can do. We've done a blocking pass, and this is something you may want to show to a client or give to a director just so that they understand where you're going with it. But the next step is to do what I call releasing the curves. In other words, going from step curves back to interpolated curves. And that will give us even a better idea as to how that animates. So again, I'm going to select my character, and this time we need to go into our graph editor, and I'm going to frame this, hit F to frame it, select all of my keyframes. Let me expand this a little bit. There we go. What I want to see is this one here, which is plateau tangents, and that's what I want to hit. And what this will do is, if he's holding, such as this first section, it will go ahead and just make all the tangents flat, so you don't get that crazy in-betweening that we had before. So let's go ahead and play this. So this is a pretty good first pass. So from here, we need to do a number of different things. One is he's holding, so we need to kind of do what's called a moving hold, and then we need to finesse the rest of this to make it a lot more realistic. So now we have the rough animation blocked out. We've got our basic timing, we've got our major poses. The next step is to go through it a section at a time and make the animation more complete. So let's play what we have right now. So we've got this character standing with his arms crossed, and then he waves. Now the first thing I notice is at the very beginning of the scene. If you look at this, he kind of dies. He's not really alive at this point. That's because when people stand still, they don't exactly stand still. They move a little bit. Gravity is pulling them down. They're shifting their weight. There's always a little bit of motion when somebody is supposedly standing still. So we can create what's called a moving hold to bring more life into this character as he's standing still. Now there are times where you want a character to stand rock solid, perhaps for comic effect, but typically if you have a character holding a pose for more than a few frames, you'll want to make that into a moving hold. So let's go ahead and do that. First thing I want to do is just zoom in on my timeline. We have basically this dead spot is from frame 1 to frame 20, so I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so I'm a little bit tighter on this timeline so you can see how we're working a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and select all my keys on my character, and let's take a look at him. So we've got a keyframe here at 20, and then he starts to move down. The first thing we need to do is understand what's going on in this character's mind. What is he doing? Right now his pose is one of, when your arms are crossed, you're kind of not wanting to participate. Let's go ahead and kind of move him back. He's not really wanting to participate, so let's kind of make this move a little bit away from the audience just to kind of give that sort of feel. So the first thing I want to do is start to work with the hips. So I've got basically the hips are in the exact same place here and here, but let's go ahead and move them. So I'm going to hit W, go into my move tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and move him back just a hair. So I'm just going from here to here. Now let's go ahead and play this back. That actually brings a little bit more life to the scene, but it's still not quite realistic. Let's go ahead and move up the body. We've just done the hips and the legs. Let's do the rest of the body. So we can do that just by playing with the spine a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and shift select just these two spine joints here. And now I'm going to go ahead and just rotate him back just a little bit, maybe back and a little bit over. So as you can see, he's kind of moving back a little bit, and then, which is actually good because it kind of complements that big forward motion as he goes into that little squash before he comes up for the wave. So let's go ahead and play this and just see how this feels. Okay, I think we can add a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and select the head a little bit, and let's go ahead and move that. Again, I'm going to move in that same direction, and let's see how that works. That's better. So now we've got this basic pose. Now if we want, we could also go ahead and add a little bit more into this just to give him a little bit more life. This probably would be sufficient, but let's kind of play with this just a little bit more. Now one of the things I think I want to do is let's go ahead and just make him a little bit more impatient. So I'm going to select his left toe, and we're going to tap his toe. So I'm going to just give myself a few frames in. So let's go into frame 2. And I'm just going to set another keyframe, which basically just sets everything at 0. So I'm going to go move forward about 4 frames, and then just move his toe up like he's tapping it. And then at frame 10, which is another 4 frames in, I'm just going to go ahead and bring that back down to 0. Let's go ahead and see how that feels. That looks good, but I think it would have more emphasis if we did it one more time, if we have one more tap on his foot. So again, I'm going to go ahead and select that toe. And so he taps here, and let's go ahead and start another tap at frame 12. Frame 16, let's rotate that up just a little bit. And then frame 20, it's actually going to come back down naturally. So let's see how that works. Okay, I think I need to bring this one up at 16 just a little bit more. So let's see. At frame 6, I had this at 15. Okay, so let's go ahead and have this at negative 15 like we have on the other frame and make this a little bit more even. So now what we have here is we have a moving hold. So his hips and his spine are just readjusting slightly to give him the illusion of life. And then in addition to that, we added one more little thing, which was tapping his toe, just to give a little bit more character and a little bit more life to the scene. So as you can see, a moving hold brings your character to life. Let's go ahead and move on to the rest of the scene. We have the basic moving hold in place. The next step is to animate the transition, the shifting of weight from the character from one foot to the other. Let's take a look at where we are in our animation. So we've got this moving hold, and then he does a transition to that wave. So we're going to work on this transition. So the first thing I want to do is let's just take a look at what the hips are doing in this transition. So I'm going to go over to my layer editor, and I'm going to hit this V, which turns off the visibility of the upper body, the head, and the eyes. And let's just take a look at what the hips are doing. So the first thing we need to understand is how the character is transferring weight. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here on the timeline so we can see what we're doing. Let's just take a look at these hips. At frame 20, the hips are in that standard pose. And what's happening here is that the weight of the character is going down the right foot. So that right leg is supporting the character. What happens is he shifts weight. So over the course of 10 frames to frame 30, he shifts his weight so that now the weight of the body is being transmitted to the ground through the left foot. In order to do that, we have to have this transitional pose. I'm going to go ahead and turn off these upper controls so we can see this even a little bit better here. So what happens is when the character shifts his weight, the hips drop. Now why is that? Well, gravity. What's happening here is that he's taken the weight off of this foot and he hasn't put it exactly onto this foot either. So what's happening is that the hips are unsupported, so gravity is pulling those down. And when he moves up into that position, then what's happening is he's pushing up to counteract the force of gravity, and now we have another reasonably stable pose. So what the point of this is that as he moves from pose to pose, he's typically shifting his weight from one foot to the other. And as the character shifts his weight, the hips will typically drop. And so this is the major point here, is as a character moves from pose to pose, the hips typically drop. And this is because when you go from pose to pose, you're shifting the character's weight from one foot to the other. When you block out your poses, one of the things you need to understand is how the character is shifting his weight. You kind of want to have him go from one foot to the other as he goes from pose to pose, so that way you have a good weight transfer. Now there's also one other thing in this little animation here, and that is the right foot. If you notice here, the right foot is actually moving as he shifts his weight. So one of the things we can do with this is actually add in a little bit more animation to make it look like he's taking a step. So we can do this by going here to this first pose here at frame 24 and doing a little bit of a move. So we're going to lift his foot at the heel. So I'm going to lift the foot up, and then I'm going to rotate that foot just a bit. So basically what's happening is he's lifting it at the heel, and then let's move halfway between 24 and 30, which would be 27, and then let's just rotate that foot up a little bit, and then at 30 it's going to naturally set down. So let's take a look at this again. So now we've got a little bit of a step. So let's take a look at this. So this is just the hips. This is just the transfer of weight. We still have a lot of work to do on the upper body. So let's go ahead and take a look at where we're at right now. So you can see that that foot change is pretty good, but we still have some work to do with this upper body. So let's go ahead and finish this up in the next lesson. Once we have the weight of the character moving from one foot to the other, we still need to work on the rest of the body. At this point, we have the computer in betweening these poses, and the computer in between isn't quite exactly what we want. So let's go ahead and fine-tune and tweak these in-betweens to make this a really strong transition. So let's go through this a frame at a time. It starts at frame 20, and at frame 22 already I'm noticing a little bit of problem. Right here, there's some interpenetration between the hand and the forearm here. And as he goes into this other pose, I'm noticing this is kind of a weak transition here, so we need to kind of work on this arm as well. So let's go through this a step at a time. The first thing I want to do is let's just focus on this outside arm, the right arm, because that's the one that's going to move first. It's kind of blocking this left hand from moving. So let's go ahead and just animate that first, and then we'll go through the other arm. So the first thing I'm noticing is that we have a little bit of this interpenetration here. So the easiest way to get rid of that is to just grab the elbow on the right arm and just rotate that a little bit out of the way. In fact, let's just rotate that down quite a bit. Now the other thing is that as this arm rotates down, the hand is going to drag, because what we have here is we have this force is moving the forearm in this direction, but the hand also has a joint, and it kind of wants to stay put. This is, again, what we call drag. Now what's going to happen here is that this wrist is going to bend back. And actually we can use this to our advantage, because what we can do is we can actually make a nice arc. As we go through these sorts of transitions here, we want to make sure that we have kind of nice poses here. This arm is kind of moving in a nice arc, and this gives the audience a visual representation of where it's moving. So if I see an arm in that position, I know that the force is coming from here and that it's moving generally in that direction. So let's go ahead and continue this. We're going to move this arm out, again at frame 24, this arc that we created here is kind of broken at this pose. So let's go ahead and put that back in. So I'm going to rotate that arm out just a little bit more. And again, I'm going to rotate this hand. And again, I want to try and create a nice arc here. So now you can see how that's coming out. And now as this comes in, let's go ahead and continue this arc a little bit and kind of bring it back and then kind of straighten it out. So really what we're getting here is we're getting almost kind of a whip action. So it almost looks like we've got kind of a whip action happening here. And here we can kind of just tweak this a sure that this hand is in a D position. So now the right arm is definitely moving a lot better. So let's go ahead and focus a little more on the left arm. So let's take a look at this. So as this arm is moving, we have a very similar situation. I'm going to have another drag that's happening on this wrist. So as we go to, say, frame 24, I'm going to move that in. And now the arm is coming up. And right here we have a kind of an awkward pose. This is really where silhouetting can help you with animation. If I were to silhouette this, you kind of see this shape here. It really is kind of an awkward shape. We can make that a lot smoother and a lot more elegant just by reposing this a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and move this arm out a little bit and then just drag that wrist back. So by doing just that little thing, what happens is we get a nice arc. Again, we're getting this kind of whip action. In fact, we're getting it here in both arms. This is a very strong silhouette, and this will actually tell the audience how this is moving. So as he brings that arm out, you can see what direction it's moving in. Gives you a much stronger sense of that motion. Now we've got one more little thing to tweak here. We've got one more major joint that we haven't really touched, and that's the head. So let's take a look at what we can do with this. So the first thing is he's moving forward. As he moves forward, again, he moves forward from the hips, so the head is going to be the last thing that moves forward. One of the things I want to do is maybe just start repositioning these keyframes. So I positioned this as kind of my master pose, but I don't have to keep this pose exactly the way that I had. So one of the things I can do is to just move that keyframe over just a little bit. So now as he comes in, his head is going to rotate down a little bit later. In fact, I can rotate that down a little bit more. And then as he comes up into this pose, the head will be the last thing, because again, it starts at the hips, moves through the spine, and the head will be the last thing that moves into position. So I'm going to grab the keyframe for the head at frame 30 and move it back 2 frames to frame 32. Now what this does is it gives me a little bit of overlap. Everything in his body is not all moving at once. It kind of gives you a much more fluid effect. So let's go ahead and just take a look at this. I've got this up to about frame 36. So let's just take a look at where we're at now. So you can see that that pose is looking pretty good. One of the things is I'm noticing is that I'm getting a little bit of a flop here on this arm. So as he comes in, it kind of just freezes there. So one of the things I can do is just move some of these keyframes back. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the keyframes in the arm and shift select and select the right arm's shoulder, elbow, and wrist, and just go ahead and move those back as well. So now at this point we're actually into the part of the animation where the character starts to wave, and we're going to go ahead and do that in the next lesson. So for this lesson, let's just go ahead and recap what we have done. We've gone through the automatic in-betweening that Maya has done for these poses, and we've fine-tuned it so that it's stronger. A lot of this involves making sure that parts of the character don't overlap, that we have strong silhouettes, and that when a character's body parts move, particularly the arms, that they move with drag, and that they give kind of a whip action to that motion. And then also we've added in a little bit of delay in the joints such as the head to give the sense that the body is not moving all at the same time. So keep these things in mind as you start to tweak your pose-to-pose animation, and it can make it a lot stronger and make your transitions a lot more effective. So let's go ahead and animate the last part of this animation, which is the character waving. A wave is a really good example of secondary motion. It's a good example of drag. And so you're going to learn a lot of these principles as we animate this. So let's go ahead and play what we have. So you can see the beginning, it looks pretty fluid, and then when it gets to that wave, well, the arm is pretty stiff. So starting at about frame 30, the last half of this animation, that arm looks like it's just stuck in place. And the reason is because, well, the arm is actually composed of 3 joints. It has the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. And each one of these will be affected by the motion of the other. So in this case, the shoulder is the thing that's driving the motion of everything else. And typically in arm motion, that's the case. So as this character moves down, you can see that what's happening is that the shoulder is pulling that arm in that direction. It's rotating. Now we have 2 other joints here. We have the elbow and the wrist, and now they want to stay where they are. This is Newton's law of motion. Object at rest wants to stay at rest. So let's take a look at this animation here. Actually, let's go ahead and make sure that we have frame 28 open here. And you can see what's happening is that the wrist is kind of coming over the top and then going into that wave. So what we need to do is make sure that we have that as part of the motion, because what's happening is that it's being pulled up, and so at this point it's still going to be rotated a little bit forward. This is because of drag, so I'm going to go ahead and rotate that a little bit forward. I'm not going to worry too much about fingers. I am going to curl those over just a little bit. And then as he comes over into that, I'm going to go ahead and straighten those up. But as he goes into this wave, what's happening is, again, the shoulder is pulling everything down, but these things want to stay up. So I'm going to go 3 frames into this first part of this cycle. Now remember, the shoulder starts moving at 30, it's down at 36, back up 6 frames later at 42. So every 6 frames we have a change of direction. So as that change of direction happens, the elbow and the wrist are going to drag behind. So I can animate this by going about halfway through that cycle. So at frame 33, or 3 frames in, I'm going to go ahead and bend the elbow. I'm going to go ahead and straighten out that wrist a little bit so we have that fully to the camera, but I'm going to bend it. Now what I've done here is I've created a pretty strong silhouette. I've also created a nice arc. So you can see I've got a really strong arc there, and again, that's going to convey information to the audience about where this joint is moving. So as we come over the top, it's going to start coming down. At the next point, which is 3 frames later, frame 36, this is where the shoulder starts moving in the opposite direction. It starts moving everything up. But one of the things we have is we still are going to have this elbow and the wrist dragging behind the motion of the shoulder. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the elbow, move it back, and again, just kind of arc that wrist back. And again, we want to just kind of get a nice arc here. So now it goes that way. And when the shoulder starts moving back, again, we have the same situation. The shoulder is moving the bicep and everything this way, but these are still moving in the opposite direction. So they want to stay where they are. They want to keep going in the direction that they're going. So we can, again, do the same thing. We can move them in the opposite direction. In this case, I'm not going to go 3 frames up. I'm just going to go 2 frames up, because this actually will lock out a little bit more quickly going in the up direction. and then I'm going to rotate that wrist as well. So what I've done is I've rotated the elbow until it's straight. Now remember, the elbow only goes so far before you're going to break it. You can probably animate it a little bit past straight, but if you go too much past it, it's going to look a little odd. And then I'm going to tilt that wrist a little bit over. So now we've got it coming like that, and that looks pretty good. But again, we have that same situation. When we come up to the next cycle, which is at frame 42, this is going to be moving back, the elbow. It's still going to be a little bit locked, and this wrist is still going to be dragging behind. So we've got it kind of straightened out here. So now it comes over the top, and now it comes up, and now is where it's going to bend down. So it's straight at 42, and now it's going to drag behind. But at this point, we actually have the pose that we want, because this pose here at 45 is going to be exactly the same as the pose we had at 33. So we can actually copy that. So I'm going to go ahead and shift select the elbow and the wrist on the left hand, go to frame 33, copy, paste at frame 45. Now the reason it's at 45 is that's 3 frames in from that start of the cycle. And again, we can do the same for the rest of the animation. In fact, we can actually start to cycle the whole thing. So I could actually copy what I had at 36 and paste it at 48, and we can actually do this cycle over again. In fact, I could do the whole thing just by shift dragging 36 through 45, copy, go to 48, and paste. So what I've done is I just copied the rest of those, and we should have a pretty good wave. So there we go. Another thing I'm noticing is that the right arm isn't really moving naturally. Let's take a look at this arm here, the right arm. You can see it's really not hanging naturally. This is supposed to be a relaxed arm. So let's go ahead and just do a few little keyframes just to kind of get it to relax here. So as he comes up into this pose, we can start to relax this arm. In fact, one of the things I want to do is maybe shift select all of these joints, make sure I have the wrist, the shoulder, and the elbow selected. And I'm actually going to go ahead and delete the keyframe that I had at frame 32. What this does is it gives the computer more time to in between into this pose here at frame 36, which will actually give it a much more gentle transition. So what I've done is I've just kind of deleted a few keyframes to give a much more gentle transition into this pose. Now at frame 42, if you look at this, it feels kind of like it's going like this. So let's go ahead and just kind of soften that up a little bit. And I can do that just by rotating that wrist and just letting that wrist hang a little bit more naturally. And again, we can do that again at frame 48. And again, I want to kind of let that arm hang just a little bit. A little bit more. And again, I'm getting this kind of break in the wrist, so I'm just going to straighten that out just a little bit on both of these frames at 54 and at 60. So that should clean it up a little bit. Let's just take a quick look at it. So let's take a look at the whole animation. Now we could go over this with a fine-tooth comb and really make sure that everything is in place. But by now you kind of get the idea of what the process is for animating pose-to-pose animation. So let's take a look at where we're at and see what this looks like. Seems pretty good. So let's go ahead and recap what the process is for animating pose-to-pose animation. First thing you need to do is you need to create your poses. Don't worry so much about timing, just get the poses in the order that you want. Next step is to block out those poses to make sure that the timing is right. Then after that, you release the curves, and then you go through and you start tweaking the animation a section at a time. And with animation, it really is what we call an iterative process. You go over it once, then you go over it again, and then you go over it again, and every time you take a pass at it, it gets a little bit cleaner, a little bit better, a little bit more lively. So if you want, go ahead and take another pass at this, clean up any rough spots you see. But the basic process of pose-to-pose animation should be clear to you by now. In this chapter, we're going to animate a simple walk cycle. Now, before we actually get into animating this walk, let's go ahead and analyze a simple walk and show you what makes a character walk, what makes a successful walk. So I have this file open here, and if we want, we can simply play it, and you can see it's just a very generic walk. So let's go into our perspective view, and I'm going to actually show you a few things. Now let's take a look at what a walk is. Well, the walk starts, it depends on what frame you want to start with, but typically how a walk happens is a character shifts his weight from foot to foot. So he puts his weight on his left foot, then shifts his weight to his right foot, and each time he does that, he pulls himself forward. So he drops his foot down, pulls himself forward, and so on. Now, in doing this, a number of anatomical things have to happen. Well, first of all, when he puts his foot out, here, he has to put it in front of the body, which means that the hips have to rotate to meet that. So let's take a look at this. So this hip is actually forward, and the other hip is actually back. But in order to maintain his balance, this shoulder has to rotate in the opposite direction. So this is one of the key things in a walk, is that when the left foot is forward, the left shoulder will be back. So let's take a look at that again, and let's just watch the shoulders. So what happens is, as this foot moves back, the shoulder moves forward. So what we have is a twisting motion of the spine. Now, when he moves his foot forward, one of the things he does is he also puts himself out of balance. So right here, he's actually falling forward just a little bit. So his weight is actually going to fall forward just a little bit. And what happens is he's going to catch his weight with this foot. So when we do that, what happens is, let's take a look at this. So when he catches his weight with his foot, he starts with a straight leg, and now that knee bends because what we're doing is we're shifting weight. We're shifting weight from this foot, the left foot, to the right foot. And the same thing happens on the other side. So he puts his foot down, puts his weight on the foot, which causes the knee to bend, and then he straightens that up as he lifts himself up, allows that foot to come through, catches the ground, cushions, extends, and then takes another step. Now, if we want, we can actually take a look at this a couple other ways. So I've got all of these geometries on layers, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the upper body so we can see how the legs move. So if you just see this, you can see how the hips are rotating left and right. So as this character moves forward, these hips rotate this way. And then when he steps the other way, the hips rotate in the opposite direction, in that direction. So let's go ahead and turn on the rest of the body. Now another thing you want to take a look at is there's also a forward and back motion of the spine. So as he catches his weight here, the spine is going to arch forward just a little bit. What that does is it's because he's catching his weight on that foot. So as soon as he catches his weight on the foot, the body kind of leans forward. Then it straightens up. Then it catches again, and then it leans forward again. Now, one more thing I want to show you is the walk from the front. Let's take a look at how the spine works. So when he puts his weight on one foot here, we've got all of the weight of the character coming down onto that foot. And what this does is this creates a large weight on this side here, which rotates this spine here, because we've got this giant weight, which is basically the character's foot, is pulling this down. And so in order to compensate for this, the spine has to arch from the front this way. Okay? So that is in the middle of the walk cycle, which we call the passing position, where the foot passes the opposite leg. So when he does that, we're going to have a little bit of a spine twist that way. So those are some of the basics of a walk, just some general guidelines, and we'll be going over these again as we animate the walk. So I just wanted to show you a few key pointers to a walk, how the hips, the spine, and the shoulders move to make a character walk successfully. Now that we understand the mechanics of a walk, let's go ahead and animate a simple walk cycle. Now I'm going to animate this walk in sections. I'm going to concentrate on the lower part of the character, more specifically the hips and the feet. Now once I get this firm foundation, I'll go ahead and move up to the upper part of the character. Now to make this as clear as possible, let's go ahead and turn off that upper part of the character. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the head as well as the upper geometry and the controls for the upper part of the character. And now all I have left is this lower part of the character. Now before we actually animate the walk, we need to make a decision as to how fast the character will walk. For this exercise, I've decided we're going to animate at 16 frames per step. Now that means a total of 32 frames for 2 steps or 1 cycle. So as you can see, we're starting at frame 1, which means we need to go 32 frames past 1 to 33. So we're going to animate from 1 to 33 for a total of 32 frames. Now once we have that set up, we can go ahead and start animating the walk. Now that we have all the preliminaries in place, let's go ahead and start blocking out the footsteps of the walk. All we want to do at this point is just get the spacing and timing of the feet right. Now we're going to start with the extended position. This is where the feet are furthest apart. Now you can start with any one of the 4 positions you want, but I find the extended position is probably the best way for the beginner to start animating a walk. So I'm going to go ahead and select one of the feet. In this case, I'm selecting the right foot, and I'm going to move it forward. Now how far forward depends on the character of the walk.